Hello everyone, thank you very much for the invitation to join you today and share some thoughts about the relationship between digital preservation and environmental sustainability. There's quite a lot we could say on this issue, so I'd like to cover a lot of ground in the next 15 minutes or so. I have 5 themes. Firstly, I want to define the digital preservation problem, as this will help establish the scope for discussions that will follow. Then I want to clarify the relationship between preservation and disposal and look at the opportunities that digital preservation creates to manage and reduce the amount of data we retain. I will then dig a bit more deeply into the ways in which digital preservation consumes energy and the implications that arise from efforts to reduce this consumption. The origins of the energy matter tremendously, as do expectations about access. Towards the end, I will take a brief detour into the history of digital preservation. This is not irrelevant to the scope of our discussion. Changes which will disrupt the digital economy will also disrupt our understanding of digital preservation. Finally, I want to reflect on the DPC and how we're beginning to make changes in our own work. So first, briefly, a definition of digital preservation. It's the series of managed activities necessary to ensure continued access to digital materials for as long as necessary. The words in bold are important. It's a process, not an event. It fits within a managed framework. It's about access, which means much more than just backup or storage. And it's for long as necessary, not forever, and certainly not everything. Digital life cycles are short, so lots of agencies, which are not archives in the traditional sense, find themselves with a digital preservation problem. What's in scope? Well, an awful lot is in scope for the digital preservation challenge. Born digital and digitised content is in scope. Structured and unstructured data is in scope. Ephemeral and essential information is in scope. Really, any digital object where the life cycle and use case is longer than the life cycle of the infrastructure upon which it was created. On the face of it, therefore, digital preservation sounds like keeping an awful lot of things, and that sounds very energy intensive. And that could be true, but only if you did it badly. Effective digital preservation is also about keeping control of the digital estate and creating permission to dispose, what to get rid of, when to get rid of it. It might sound strange that I start a talk about digital preservation with the theme of disposal, but the two are connected. Digital preservation is the opposite of unmanaged proliferation. We can at least agree about the opportunity to get rid of duplicates. One of the most frequently asked questions in digital preservation is how many copies should we keep? And there's no real answer because it depends on the use case and the risks faced. But a rule of thumb would suggest that 3 copies is the minimum we would need to keep. That's on the basis that you need to poll 2 files to establish if a third file is corrupt. I can imagine there's a case for more copies, but remember that the more copies you have, the more you introduce noise into the system. So taken to an extreme, too many copies creates greater risk, not less. So in any case, from the perspective of digital preservation, I am suggesting that we need to triple the data storage. And that sounds like it could quickly get out of hand. But let's remember, good archivists, we've already selected the most important parts of the digital estate for preservation. Those parts which we don't want to leave to the mercy of bit rot or format obsolescence or the disruption caused by corporate planning. Although I'm calling for 3 copies, I'm calling for 3 copies based on a small percentage of the overall collection. And when we make that selection, we give ourselves permission to dispose of the other 90%. So my argument therefore is that digital preservation provides an informed and sustainable basis for reducing your data footprint and by extension reducing your carbon footprint too. It's inherently a green choice. As an aside, there are particular challenges associated with preserving long-range scientific data about climate change. Now, it stands to reason that we'd want to preserve such data because its value and usefulness only grows through time. But universities here in the UK and in the US have faced quite serious denial of service attacks because they've published findings or gathered data which might be considered hostile to vested interests. There have been concerted, if obscure, efforts to make research institutions think twice before engaging in climate science. So while there are very strong intellectual cases to be made about preserving scientific research data about the environment, different types of risk arise there also. Considering the very large numbers involved, one might be tempted to think of data storage as the energy-intensive bit of preservation. It doesn't have to be, especially insofar as energy can be drawn from renewables. The source of the energy matters a great deal, as does the type of storage used. There are some good and also some very bad practices in the management of data centres and cloud computing, for example. There are economies of scale here. A small number of large data centres will generally consume less energy than a large number of small ones. And this is one of the claimed benefits of cloud computing, though not all commentators agree. A cloud data centre consumes about the same amount of energy as around 5,000 homes, not to mention the costs and environmental cost, that might say catastrophe, of power distribution. So let's not think of the cloud as some ethereal and intangible summer's day. Remember also the extent to which cloud service providers are dependent on public subsidy, no matter how much they look like private corporations. But it's really a matter about energy supply and how much we trust the cloud service providers to tell the truth about where they get their electricity. For example, data centres operated by Google and by Apple in North Carolina take energy directly from the state's powered grid, which in turn depends on around 50% of its supply from coal and 39% from nuclear. Now, if you're already in North Carolina, you would still achieve carbon reductions by using a cloud data centre over a proliferation of local network drives in a series of small data centres, all drawing from the same supply. But if you were in Finland, it would be ecological madness to use a service in North Carolina. The CSC data centre in Kajaani, established with its own hydroelectric plant, means that Finnish researchers can store and access their data with virtually zero carbon emissions. Every touch point in a digital preservation workflow requires energy. Ingest workflows, migration, or access, for example. So as well as reducing the data volumes, we need to ask how many times a file needs to be processed. This is immensely dependent on circumstances. There are some high value or high risk environments where chain of custody really matters and you'd want to monitor the integrity of a file more or less continuously. But computing across a large data set is going to require processor time, and the larger the data set, the more energy that will require. So there's an argument about creating a risk profile and acting strategically depending on the real risks that arise. Migration too might be an example of this. Should we migrate and normalise files on receipt at the repository, or do we migrate only when the need arises? There are arguments both ways, again depending on the specific use case, but it's time that we included the energy cost of migrating files into the discussion. Let's also talk about access. Remember that instant access means spinning disks, and if it's global instant access, then it's likely to be data cached in numerous locations around the world. Spinning disks are very intensive in terms of energy consumption, as against tape or offline disk storage. But both of those are slower in terms of delivery. So offline storage comes with slower access, so it's less good for the users, but is much healthier for the environment. There's a habit in digital preservation to treat objects as either preserved or not preserved, and to treat repositories as trusted or not trusted. But considering the climate emergency, I'm beginning to think that we need to admit the possibility of something in between. Files which are checked occasionally, formats that are not migrated unless somebody really needs them, access which is slower but more sustainable. Before we end, I want to step us back for a moment and reflect on the seriousness of the challenge ahead of us with respect to the climate crisis. This presentation occurs in the context of a major effort to recalibrate and intensify efforts to address climate change. A mile or so down the road from me here in Glasgow, world leaders at COP26 are working through the causes and consequences of the climate crisis and debating plans, if any can be found, to avert the ensuing human calamity. It's hard to imagine anything more important, and I sincerely hope that delegates there have no shortage of ambition. And it may seem strange to be talking about digital preservation while such great matters are at stake. But the roots of our challenge are tangled with the roots of the bigger one. Although you can certainly find earlier examples, digital preservation really emerged in the mid-1990s in response to the widespread move from analogue to digital, brought about by the home computer and then the internet. And although we spend a lot of time resolving issues of technology and storage and meaning making, the origins and causes of digital preservation are really entwined with the social and economic forces that have propelled the digital shift. Digital preservation is symptomatic of the accelerating cycles of innovation, adoption and disruption which have characterised information technology in the last 50 years. Market forces mean we have locked ourselves into short life cycles of technology, where obsolescence is taken for granted and infrastructures are disposable. One might be tempted to call this obsolescence as a service, if only we could be clear whom the obsolescence serves. I sometimes think of digital preservation as an insurgency against deeply embedded economic forces which sit behind technology, a kind of obsolescence rebellion against non-renewable consumption. I'm dithering. My point is that the climate crisis will impact almost every aspect of our lives. It's possible, in fact it's very likely, that we have unsustainable assumptions embedded into our professional practice and our institutions. The climate crisis will challenge these, and we need to be ready for the disruption that will follow. A pivot to sustainable long-term business models in the technology sector will alter how we approach preservation. As with digital preservation, so with the climate crisis. Short-term thinking serves no one in the long term. The best long-term answer, the only one which will ultimately succeed, will be to make obsolescence obsolete. Finally, a word about the DPC. I will freely admit that our own work on green issues has been too sketchy for too long. I spoke at the IPRES conference around this in 2010, but it was to an empty room. No one seemed very interested. It didn't occur to us to include carbon costs into the cost models and risk management tools that we've developed over the years since. But that's changing. For example, we've now written environmental impacts into the rapid assessment model, so DPC members are being invited to embed benchmarks about energy consumption and green policies within their preservation activities. The DPC's new strategic plan will explicitly commit us to the Sustainable Development Goals, and we're going to set these not simply as aspirations or values as they were before, but as auditable goals for which we will be accountable. As with climate action, so with digital preservation. We have a relatively simple choice: to act in earnest, with courage now, or throw our hands in the air and hope for something new. To be an ancestor, or to be a good ancestor. That's an easy choice.